The silence following the initial tremors of societal breakdown is not the silence of peace, but the quiet of exhausted fear. In those first tumultuous weeks, the metric of survival seemed brutally simple. Volume. Those who had hoarded, who had dedicated entire basements to dense towers of stored calories, felt a grim, momentary superiority. The popular narrative, etched into the collective anxiety of the modern world, promised safety to those who secured the immediate fuel necessary for flight or fortification. Yet, 6 months into this new, desolate calculus, a deeper, more insidious truth began to reveal itself, a biological irony that overturned every amateur survival fantasy. In a suburban neighborhood now swallowed by overgrown lawns and stillness, they found the man known only as Arthur. His modest house, secured with salvaged lumber and heavy bolts, had been meticulously maintained against external threats. The basement, cool and dry, contained an arsenal of long-term supplies, 40-pound sacks of grain stacked 5 high, and row upon row of canned goods gleaming dully under the beam of a weak flashlight. Arthur had planned for years. He had meticulously calculated his minimum daily caloric intake, ensuring enough dense, durable fuel to sustain him for 3 years of sedentary existence. When they finally breached the heavy door, the scene was a chilling tableau of failed foresight. Arthur lay peacefully on a cot near his stores, his demise unmarked by violence or acute starvation. He had food, mountains of it, easily accessible. The forensic analysis confirmed the quiet, internal killer. Acute, terminal malnutrition. He had died not from lack of energy, but from a catastrophic internal failure of systems, poisoned by the very abundance he had secured. This singular fate exposes the lethal secret residing beneath the surface of every conventional dogma. A full belly means precisely nothing if the fuel consumed is biologically flawed. The enemy is not the empty stomach. The true adversary is ignorance, a profound lack of understanding regarding the body's mandatory molecular demands. The death of Arthur was a brutal testament to the fact that the human body is not a crude furnace running purely on British thermal units. It is a complex, delicate ecosystem reliant on a continuous, molecular symphony. When that symphony stops, usually due to the quiet absence of a few milligrams of key compounds, the intricate machine collapses, regardless of the surrounding wealth of preserved foodstuffs. The prevailing narrative of sustained survival focuses overwhelmingly on visible threats, scarcity, conflict, and immediate caloric debt. This investigation strips away those surface anxieties to confront the microscopic reality of long-term human function in isolation. We must move beyond the simple metrics of caloric density, the ceiling of common staples like white rice and dried beans and bags and rigid plastic bucket sand, delve into the rigorous mathematics of biological precision. The journey ahead is an exploration into deficiency, a study of the silent, degenerative forces that turn stockpiled calories into biological poison. We will chart the necessity of high-yield essential fats and, critically, the yet life-saving arsenal of micronutrients, the defensive compounds essential to warding off diseases like scurvy, irreversible neurological damage, and systemic cardiovascular failure. Survival is not mere accumulation. It is the mastery of inventory management and the sophisticated chemistry required to maintain the integrity of the human operating system over years, not weeks. This detailed blueprint offers not a collection of vague, optimistic instructions, but a disciplined, comprehensive plan for sustained function, ensuring that survival extends far beyond the initial, chaotic months. Viewers will be armed with a pantry designed for biological reality, not blind hope, an essential defense against the invisible killer that claimed Arthur's life. The fundamental misunderstanding that killed Arthur is shared by countless others. A global reliance on caloric quantity that ignores the fundamental requirement for biological completeness. The challenge is not merely feeding the body, but perfecting the fuel matrix required to keep the human engine running efficiently for 3 sustained years without external resupply. The first critical error in conventional stockpiling lies in the overwhelming emphasis on bulk caloric staples. The trinity of white rice, dried beans, and wheat flour. These items are the bedrock of modern long-term storage, prized for their incredible shelf life, low cost, and high density. They solved the volume problem with undeniable efficiency. A 55-gallon drum can store millions of calories, enough to fend off immediate hunger for years. Yet, this strategy is inherently flawed because it attempts to reduce the staggering complexity of human metabolism to a simple energy equation. The historical record is replete with examples of this failure, illustrating that civilization's greatest long-term disasters were often preceded by nutritional bottlenecks. Consider the voyages of early global exploration. Ships packed with hardtack and salted meats, designed to provide adequate caloric throughput for months, routinely lost half their crew not to storm or battle, but to the slow, agonizing atrophy caused by scurvy. Explorers died, surrounded by barrels of energy-rich sustenance. Scurvy, the infamous scourge of the sea, is merely the clinical manifestation of chronic vitamin C deficiency, a biological debt accrued when the body cannot synthesize this vital antioxidant and cofactor. Without adequate ascorbic acid, the body's ability to synthesize collagen deteriorates, leading to internal hemorrhaging, the breakdown of connective tissues, and eventually terminal systemic collapse. For centuries, this killer was attributed to bad air or bad luck, when in reality, it was the absolute absence of fresh produce, an ingredient deemed too perishable for long voyages. Similarly, the focus on heavily processed dense carbohydrates, such as refined white rice, leads directly to This condition, caused by a lack of thiamine, vitamin B, was rampant in populations whose diets relied almost exclusively on milled grains, the very staples prioritized in long-term storage. Thiamine is crucial for metabolizing carbohydrates into usable energy. Its absence causes severe neurological and cardiovascular damage. The symptoms range from crippling peripheral neuropathy and muscle weakness to acute heart failure. A person could consume 3,000 calories a day of white rice, remain perpetually full, and yet succumb within months to heart enlargement and nervous system decay because the necessary catalyst vitamin B1 was stripped away during the milling process that grants the rice its desirable long shelf life. This historical data translates directly into the contemporary survival scenario. The typical survival cache is a nutritional desert, rich in starch and protein but devoid of the volatile, perishable micronutrients that maintain cellular integrity and neurological function. The initial assessment of a 3-year stockpile must, therefore, be predicated not on total caloric output, but on the meticulous inventorying of the body's non-negotiable chemical requirements. The shift in perspective necessitates a move toward viewing food storage as pharmaceutical inventory management. The goal is to sustain peak cognitive and physical function, not merely to avoid skeletal collapse. This requires a three-pronged biological strategy focused on density, preservation, and diversity of essential non-caloric inputs. First, the caloric bedrock must be refined. While rice and beans remain economically unavoidable, they must be treated as a fuel matrix needing serious fortification. The calculation is not simply 2,000 calories per day multiplied by 1,095 days, yielding 2.19 million calories per person for 3 years. The critical addition is fat. Fats are the densest caloric source, yielding 9 calories per gram compared to 4 for carbohydrates and proteins. In a low-activity survival scenario, the body requires concentrated energy to maximize storage space efficiency. But not just any fat suffices. Essential fatty acids, EFAs, specifically omega-3 South and omega, are non-synthesizable by the human body and crucial for brain health, hormone production, and inflammation regulation. The storage of these critical fats presents a significant preservation challenge. Liquid oils, such as olive or vegetable oil, turn rancid quickly, degrading into toxic free radicals. Even when carefully sealed, the solution lies in stabilized, solidified forms. Coconut oil, due to its high saturated fat content, is significantly more stable than polyunsaturated oils, offering a 2-year shelf life under ideal, cool conditions. Lard or ghee, clarified butter, when properly rendered and sealed, can also provide necessary energy and stability. However, even these must be supplemented by sources of EFAs, which often means prioritizing select, densely packed, shelf-stable seeds or nuts rigorously vacuum-sealed and protected from light and temperature fluctuations. The most profound failure of the conventional stockpile remains the invisible depletion of vitamins and minerals. The greatest threat to the survivalist, operating in isolation, is not a roving band of scavengers, but the slow, inevitable creep of physiological collapse brought on by The core vulnerability is vitamin C. Since it cannot be stored by the body, a constant supply is mandatory. Without access to fresh citrus, berries, or green strawberry, items that perish first in a widespread disaster, the countdown to scurvy begins, typically taking between 1 and 3 months. The solution must be pharmaceutical. Stored, stabilized ascorbic acid vitamin C powder is remarkably shelf-stable if kept cool, dark, and air-tight. A 3-year supply for one person requires approximately 1 kilogram of pharmaceutical-grade powder, packaged into small, vacuum-sealed pouches to mitigate moisture degradation upon opening. This tiny volume of white powder represents the difference between sustained health and a painful, debilitating, and ultimately fatal deterioration of the vascular system. Beyond vitamin C, the critical B-complex vitamins must be addressed with equal rigor. As demonstrated by the historical prevalence of beriberi, reliance on refined grains guarantees a thiamine deficit, while supplementing with thiamine B1 is necessary. A comprehensive B-complex supplement addresses the interconnected web of B vitamins B2 riboflavin, B3 niacin, B6 pyridoxine, B9 folate, and B12 cobalamin, all critical for energy production, nerve function, and DNA synthesis. B vitamins are water-soluble and easily depleted under stress. Unlike vitamin C, which is required daily, B-complex supplements, particularly B12, can be stored in relatively large doses. A high-quality stabilized multivitamin or dedicated B-complex blend, stored in dark glass containers, represents an essential long-term survival insurance policy. The fat-soluble vitamins A, D, E, and K pose a different challenge. They are required in smaller quantities, but are crucial for vision, bone health, immune function, and blood clotting. Vitamin D is synthesized by the body via sunlight exposure, but in times of high stress, forced indoors isolation, or living in northern latitudes during winter, supplementation is vital. Vitamin A, critical for immune health and vision, especially night vision, is nearly absent in typical staples like rice and beans. This brings the discussion inevitably to the most expensive and often ignored category in the survival pantry: high-yield freeze-dried vegetables and fruits. While dried beans and rice fulfill the bulk caloric need, only carefully preserved produce can reliably deliver the necessary micronutrient complexity and fiber matrix required for 3 years of sustained biological function. Freeze-drying is the preservation process of choice because it removes water content through sublimation under vacuum, preserving up to 97% of the original nutritional content, far superior to traditional air drying or canning, which involve heat degradation. These freeze-dried items, such as broccoli florets, spinach, strawberries, and carrots, are not merely flavor enhancers. They are the primary source of otherwise unavailable phytonutrients, antioxidants, and trace minerals. The high cost of these items often deters the amateur, yet their inclusion is non-negotiable for true long-term viability. A 3-year one-person cache requires calculating the minimum daily intake of essential greens and colored vegetables, approximately 100 grams of reconstituted weight, and scaling this to the necessary volume of freeze-dried material. This volume, meticulously sealed in oxygen-absorbing mylar bags, and then placed within protective rodent-proof buckets, is the single greatest determinant of successful long-term nutritional stability. Neglecting this step reduces the entire stockpile to the biological equivalent of nutritional white noise high-energy intake with zero systemic maintenance. The transition from theoretical requirement to practical inventory management introduces the complex logistics of a 3-year biological blueprint. This is where discipline replaces wishful thinking. The methodology must be based on a scientific rigor that mirrors professional logistics operations, utilizing the principles of inventory rotation, environmental control, and systematic deficiency mitigation. The core blueprint demands a tiered storage system. Tier 1 holds the bulk staples. The high-density, low-micronutrient carriers: rice, beans, grains. These are stored for maximum duration, 25+ years, in oxygen-free environments. Tier 2 comprises the high-yield fats and proteins, peanut butter powder stabilized, solidified oils, and self-stabilized canned meats: canned chicken, tuna. These have a shorter, but manageable, shelf life, 3 to 5 years, and require meticulous rotation. Tier 3, the most crucial and perishable tier, is the micronutrient arsenal. This includes pharmaceutical-grade vitamins, specialized supplements like calcium, magnesium, and iodine tablets, and the freeze-dried produce. These items have highly specific storage requirements: darkness, stable temperature, ideally below 60 degrees Fahrenheit, and absolute dryness. Their effective lifespan, even under optimal conditions, rarely exceeds 10 years, making annual rotation or consumption critical. The storage logistics for micronutrient supplements require precision. The greatest enemy of a vitamin tablet is moisture. Standard plastic bottles are inadequate for multi-year storage in potentially damp environments. The vitamins must be decanted into smaller, vacuum-sealed glass vials or mylar pouches containing desiccant packs, then placed within the final protective bucket. This process prevents exposure to moisture or air during the infrequent periods when the primary stores are accessed. The goal is to open the container only to extract the necessary 3-month supply, minimizing exposure for the remaining cache. A crucial consideration often overlooked is the psychological and physical stress placed on the body during a societal collapse. Stress significantly elevates the body's metabolic rate and its requirement for specific nutrients, particularly B vitamins and vitamin C. The standard recommended daily allowance, RDA, utilized in peacetime may be entirely insufficient during high-stress survival operations. Tere fuori. The blueprint dictates a buffer. All calculated micronutrient requirements should be increased by a minimum of 50% to compensate for elevated stress metabolism and minor potential degradation of the stored product over time. For instance, the typical requirement for vitamin C is around 60 to 100 milligrams per day. The survivalist, under sustained high stress and suboptimal dietary conditions, should plan for an intake closer to 150 to 200 milligrams per day, demanding a larger initial volume of the ascorbic acid powder. This 50% buffer represents a margin of biological safety, turning a bare minimum into a functional reserve. The inventory management system itself is paramount. Every bucket, mylar bag, and glass vial must be meticulously cataloged and dated. The methodology requires a simple, yet rigorous first-in, first-out rotation, which is often difficult to implement in an emergency scenario where access is constrained. Therefore, the long-term stores Tier 1 should be separated physically from the short-term, rotational stores Tier 2 and 3. The failure to rotate and consume the perishable micronutrient supply guarantees its eventual collapse, leaving the survivor facing the fate of Arthur, surrounded by inert calories. The mathematics of cost are unavoidable. The nutritional complexity required for 3 years of peak function drastically increases the investment compared to simple bulk hoarding. The cost of freeze-dried produce, specialized protein powders, such as whey or soy isolate for muscle maintenance, and pharmaceutical-grade supplements can easily equal or exceed the cost of the bulk staples. However, this expenditure must be viewed as an investment in human capital. A person debilitated by scurvy or rendered neurologically impaired by beriberi is not a functional survivor. They are a liability. The investment in micronutrients is the premium paid for cognitive sharpness and physical resilience. Beyond the core vitamin deficiencies, the need for mineral supplementation must be integrated into the plan. Iodine, historically added to table salt, is essential for thyroid function. While iodized salt has a shelf life of around 5 years, a backup supply of stabilized potassium iodide tablets is prudent, doubling as a prophylactic against radiation exposure, a secondary threat often associated with mass disruption scenarios. Calcium and magnesium are equally critical. Calcium, essential for bone density and nerve signaling, is often deficient in plant-heavy diets. Magnesium, crucial for over 300 enzymatic processes, aids in sleep regulation and muscle function, both critical for sustained operation under duress. These mineral supplements, stored dry and dark, form a secondary line of pharmaceutical defense. The narrative of survival often ignores the long, grinding tedium of isolation and caloric monotony. The human diet, historically and evolutionarily, is built upon sensory diversity and seasonal variation. A diet consisting primarily of bland rice and beans, even if fortified with the necessary powders, leads to psychological distress and adherence fatigue. This psychological factor has a direct biological impact, increasing stress hormones and potentially disrupting nutrient absorption. To mitigate this, the blueprint integrates the concept of palatability persistence. Small volumes of high durable flavored enhancers must be included, not merely as luxuries, but as psychological necessities. These include highly concentrated bouillon cubes for sodium and flavor, dried herbs and spices, which often retain latent antioxidant properties, and small caches of honey or sugar for morale and quick energy bursts. These items aid compliance with the monotonous primary diet and help the body process the large volume of complex carbohydrates. The final element in biological precision is water purification and integration. Even the most perfect nutritional matrix fails if the delivery mechanism is compromised. Stored water, while essential, requires meticulous rotation and treatment to prevent microorganism growth. Furthermore, the reliance on powders and freeze-dried products necessitates a robust, reliable, and sustainable water source, whether through large-scale collection and filtering utilizing high-capacity carbon filtration systems and reverse osmosis units, where possible, or through chemical sterilization. Bleach or iodine tablets used sparingly. The quality of the water directly impacts the absorption rate of all supplements and nutrients. Contaminated water leads to debilitating gastrointestinal distress, rendering the stored food useless and rapidly accelerating dehydration and biological debt. The lessons learned from Arthur's demise underscore a fundamental truth. The modern human, removed from the intricate, globally optimized food chain, is chemically vulnerable. The globalized diet provides an invisible insurance policy against deficiencies. The system is so robust that pellagra, beriberi, and scurvy are clinical curiosities rather than common threats. When that system fails, the biological clock starts ticking immediately, demanding proactive, scientific intervention. The creation of a biologically resilient 3-year stockpile transcends mere preparation. It becomes an act of rigorous stewardship over the fragile machinery of life. It requires the disciplined mindset of a chemist and a logistician, not merely a hoarder. The shelves of the ultimate survival pantry do not boast towering stacks of identical canned goods, but rather a carefully calibrated mosaic of bulk calories, shelf-stable fats, and small, high-density containers of pharmaceutical and freeze-dried necessities. The analysis concludes with a profound reassessment of the definition of survival success. It is not simply the avoidance of death, but the sustained maintenance of complex biological function. The survivor must remain capable of critical thinking, complex problem-solving, sustained physical labor, and immune system resilience against opportunistic pathogens. These functions are entirely dependent on micronutrients, the invisible components that prevent systemic breakdown. In the long twilight following a collapse, when the initial shock has faded into the quiet routine of scarcity, the true measure of preparedness is revealed. Those who focused only on the visible battle of caloric input will, like Arthur, face a silent, internal enemy. They failed to recognize the cascading failure of biological systems deprived of essential catalysts. The informed survivor, however, moves past the chaos, sustained by a meticulous inventory, understanding that the greatest defense is not physical fortification, but unwavering commitment to biological precision. Their pantry is not a tomb of inert calories, but a carefully managed chemistry lab, ensuring the enduring vitality required to navigate a world fundamentally reshaped by loss. This blueprint serves as a final, definitive warning and a guide. Hoarding is instinct, survival is science. The difference between a peaceful demise like Arthur's and sustained, functional resilience lies in the kilogram of vitamin C powder, the carefully sealed vials of and the costly, nutrients freeze dried greens that transform bulk fuel into biological gold. Mastering the inventory, understanding the body's chemistry, and maintaining the discipline to execute the rotation plan, these are the prerequisites for navigating the long, dark stretch beyond the initial year. The true legacy of Arthur is the stark realization that in the absence of civilization, ignorance is indeed the real killer. The discussion now shifts from passive storage to the proactive management of biological waste streams, the essential, continuous process of bodily detoxification that, if compromised, quickly transforms accumulated reserves into a slow-acting poison. Sustained function demands more than just perfect nutrient absorption. It requires efficient cellular house cleaning. Think of the body not merely as a machine fueled by specific inputs, but as a meticulously balanced ecosystem where waste removal is as critical as energy delivery. In a survival scenario, caloric density often comes packaged with increased metabolic waste products. Consider, for instance, the reliance on high-protein sources essential for maintaining muscle mass. The breakdown of protein results in nitrogenous waste, primarily urea, which must be filtered and excreted by the kidneys. If water intake is insufficient, or the kidneys are already stressed by mineral imbalance, this waste accumulates, leading to nitrogen toxicity and systemic fatigue, breakdown, often mistaken for simple exhaustion or caloric deficit. The physical reality of long-term survival, therefore, hinges on robust renal function. Consequently, the blueprint must incorporate compounds that support the liver and kidneys, organs working overtime to process dense, often monotonous survival diets. Another crucial layer is fiber. While micronutrients grab the headline, bulk fiber, absent in most concentrated staple calories, serves as the gut's primary tool for motility and the binding agent for toxins. Insufficient fiber leads to chronic constipation, a condition that might seem minor, but rapidly escalates in a stressful, unsanitary environment, contributing significantly to systemic inflammation and hindering the absorption of those critical stored vitamins. Incorporating high-fiber additives, such as psyllium husk powder or substantial reserves of dried lentils, which also provide protein, is an operational necessity, not an optional digestive aid. Building on this, however, the microbiome, the vast internal population of bacteria residing in the digestive tract, emerges as a critical, fragile component of long-term resilience. This microscopic community, responsible for synthesizing certain B vitamins and regulating immune response, thrives on dietary diversity. When a diet narrows drastically to rice and beans, the specialized flora that support optimal health begin to perish, replaced by less beneficial or even harmful species. This dysbiosis severely degrades the body's ability to extract the maximum value from the stored foods, turning what should be a 3-year supply into a 2-year or even 18-month effective supply due to poor absorption. The preemptive inclusion of stabilized probiotics, shelf-stable bacterial cultures packaged in protective capsules, moves from a supplemental luxury to a biological core strategy. These capsules serve as microscopic, self-sustaining reinforcement troops, ensuring the gut remains a high-efficiency processing plant. Moreover, the long-term stockpile requires dedicated reserves of fermented foods, such as shelf-stable, kimchi, or sauerkraut, in sealed pouches, which, beyond offering flavor variety, provide natural, living cultures and organic acids essential for maintaining gut pH and protecting against pathogenic overgrowth. Furthermore, we must address the relentless physiological burden of chronic, low-grade dehydration, prevalent even among those who believe they are drinking enough. In a post-collapse environment, the physical labor involved in water filtering, boiling often, discourages adequate intake. The subtle, yet disastrous, impact of chronic dehydration includes diminished cognitive function affecting critical, reduced kidney efficiency, and exacerbated symptoms of micronutrient deficiency because absorption and distribution are compromised. Therefore, the essential inventory must include sophisticated electrolyte mixtures. These are not merely salt packets. They are precisely balanced combinations of sodium, potassium, and magnesium designed to ensure cellular hydration and nerve signal stability, maintaining the fluid balance essential for both mental acuity and physical endurance. The failure to maintain this fluid homeostasis effectively neuters the entire caloric and vitamin investment, proving that even the most meticulously assembled chemical defense is worthless if the water delivery system fails. The persistent threat to the long-term survivor is not solely rooted in internal metabolic waste, but in the insidious contamination of the compromised environment itself. As civil infrastructure degrades, the seemingly pristine aquifers and local watersheds become vulnerable conduits for toxic agents previously regulated or diluted to insignificance. Specifically, the leaching of heavy metals compounds like lead, cadmium, and arsenic from corroded industrial sites and failing municipal pipelines poses a silent, chronic poisoning far more dangerous than an acute bacterial infection. These metals accumulate slowly in the body's tissues, disrupting enzyme function, impairing neurological signaling, and severely taxing the hematopoietic system. The survivalist may maintain a perfect caloric profile, yet still succumb to the cumulative, irreversible damage of environmental toxicity, manifesting as chronic fatigue, debilitating neuropathy, or eventual organ failure. Consequently, the blueprint for sustained function necessitates a defense against these non-biological contaminants. While general filtration systems remove suspended solids and some organic compounds, they are often insufficient against dissolved metals. The sophisticated survival cache must include reserves of highly specialized, inert sequestering agents. The inclusion of pharmaceutical-grade activated carbon, stored in high volume, transitions from a medical item used for acute poisoning to a daily prophylactic supplement. This substance, with its enormous surface area and high absorption capacity, acts as a chemical sponge within the digestive tract, binding toxins before they can be systemically absorbed. This is distinct from simple fiber. Activated carbon chemically targets the molecular structure of ingested poisons and heavy metals, offering a critical layer of internal defense against the external decay of the environment. Another crucial layer involves managing the hidden metabolic toll exacted by sustained, low-grade exposure to pathogens. When sanitation falters and water sources are perpetually suspect, the immune system transitions into a state of chronic, low-level activation. This persistent state of inflammation, the body's constant readiness for microbial invasion, creates a significant metabolic overdraft. The relentless production of inflammatory markers and cellular repair mechanisms disproportionately consumes essential stored antioxidants like vitamin E and the trace mineral selenium, draining the critical reserves set aside for acute crises. This constant consumption means the survivor is perpetually running a nutrient deficit, even when caloric input seems adequate. The high cost of immune vigilance silently siphons resources, accelerating the onset of fatigue and leaving the body dangerously vulnerable to sudden, overwhelming infection. To counteract this persistent drain, specific botanical defenses designed for hepatoprotection must be integrated into the pharmaceutical inventory. The liver is the primary processor of the inflammatory byproducts and circulating toxins resulting from this chronic immune stress. Sustaining liver integrity under these conditions requires more than just general vitamin support. Specialized, stabilized extracts, such as silymarin, derived from milk thistle, possess well-documented hepatoprotective qualities, stabilizing cellular membranes and supporting the regeneration of liver tissue. These compounds are non-caloric chemical sustainment tools, dedicated entirely to preventing the functional collapse of the body's central detoxification engine, thereby safeguarding the entire metabolic equilibrium. Furthermore, structural integrity requires attention to specialized trace minerals often relegated to afterthought. The dynamic demands of an austere environment, physical labor, bodyabilitarian, and the risk of traumatic injury plus high stress on bones and connective tissue. Beyond the general requirements for calcium, two specific microminerals, zinc and strontium, become critically important. Zinc is essential for hundreds of enzymatic processes, most notably rapid wound healing and T-cell mediated immunity. Strontium, often overlooked, plays a distinct role in osteogenesis, influencing the rate of bone matrix repair. A minor injury, easily dismissed in a modern hospital setting, can become a life-threatening, debilitating event in isolation. Thus, a dedicated inventory of high-purity zinc and strontium, precisely measured and carefully stored, serves as an essential biological repair kit ensuring that the machine not only runs but can reliably mend itself after operational damage. This holistic approach, addressing internal waste, external toxins, immune overdraft, and structural resilience, defines the true depth of biological preparedness, moving beyond the sheer mass of calories and the foundational necessity of micronutrient The rigorous architecture of biological endurance must confront a more elusive enemy, the self-inflicted damage wrought by chronic psychological duress, sustained isolation, constant vigilance, and the pervasive uncertainty of a collapsed civilization trigger the hypothalamus-pituitary-adrenal HPA axis into catastrophic overdrive. This floods the system with cortisol, a hormone vital for immediate flight or fight, yet devastating in perpetual excess. Cortisol is inherently catabolic. It systematically cannibalizes muscle tissue to maintain blood sugar levels, even if the survivor is eating adequate protein. Over the long haul, this constant chemical drain leads not just to physical weakness, but to an irreversible erosion of immune integrity and cognitive function. The quiet, internal surrender of the high-performing machine. The challenge of sustained output, consequently, mandates an internal hormonal defense, a pharmacological counterbalance to the stress state. This necessitates incorporating highly stable adaptogenic compounds into the survival cache. These specialized botanicals, such as standardized extracts of rhodiola rossi or the root compounds of ashwagandha, act not as suppressants, but as modulators of the HPA axis, helping the cellular machinery resist the destructive peaks of chronic cortisol exposure. Stored in desiccated, encapsulated form, these substances preserve the high-level neural pathways, minimizing the mental fog and decision fatigue that so often plague long-term survivors, ensuring that clarity and sound judgment remain accessible when error carries the ultimate penalty. This investment targets the most critical organ for survival, the executive function of the brain. Another crucial layer of maintenance extends to the often ignored scaffolding of the body, the connective tissue. While protein intake may sustain muscle bulk, the ligaments, tendons, and cartilage structures constantly stressed by rigorous physical labor demand specialized inputs for repair. These tissues rely on precise molecular architectures, particularly the resilient cross-linking of collagen fibers. The primary raw material for this elasticity is sulfur. Standard diets provide sulfur, but the monotonous survival regime risks critical deficiency. Therefore, a reserve of methylsulfonylethone, MESM, a stable, organic sulfur compound, becomes indispensable. Stored in crystalline form, MSM ensures the body retains the necessary feedstock to repair microtears in strained joints and maintain the elasticity required for continuous mobility, effectively protecting the survivor from debilitating structural breakdown that could render them immobile and vulnerable. Further refinement of energy logistics requires addressing efficiency at the most fundamental level. Mitochondrial core of the cell. The caloric matrix is useless if the cellular powerhouses cannot convert fuel into adenosine triphosphate ATP with peak efficiency. As the body ages or endures continuous oxidative stress, mitochondrial function inevitably declines, leading to pervasive fatigue despite caloric abundance. To mitigate this decline, the inclusion of coenzyme Q1 or CoA, a critical enzyme in the electron transport chain, is paramount. This expensive, highly sensitive compound, stored under nitrogen-flushed seals to prevent oxidation, acts as a cellular lubricant, maximizing the energy yield from every gram of stored carbohydrate or fat. This strategic intervention ensures the survivor maintains a functional energy surplus, distinguishing vigorous capability from mere sustained existence. Finally, the inventory methodology for these highly volatile reserves must be entirely segregated from the bulk staples. These are not stored in opaque plastic buckets, but in small, meticulously labeled, dark glass vials, encased within secondary protective foam and monitored monthly. The management of pharmaceutical tinctures, such as concentrated coctin or adaptogen extracts, demands precise biological inventory, auditing a logbook detailing consumption against measurable performance metrics, like resting heart rate, cognitive processing speed via timed internal mental exercises, and perceived exertion. This rigorous process transforms the pantry from a mere storehouse into a living chemistry lab, ensuring that the rarest Most potent defenses are deployed only at the exact moment biological need dictates, securing the enduring functionality required for survival measured in years, not months. The comprehensive inventory management, essential for long-term viability, must extend its protective reach beyond the metabolic core and the structural integrity of the bones and muscle, encompassing the vulnerable sensory and processing apparatus that interfaces directly with the harsh external environment. Shifting focus. The next critical front in the biological war for sustainability is the integrity of the oral cavity and the highly sensitive visual system. These structures, often dismissed in the context of caloric survival, represent indispensable tools for foraging, defense, and the meticulous administration of stored supplements. Their failure equates to catastrophic systemic vulnerability. The oral cavity, constantly under siege by the inevitable carbohydrate load of even the most fortified survival diet, becomes a primary gateway for systemic collapse. Sustained consumption of milled grains and dried sugars, coupled with the absence of professional hygiene and preventative care, accelerates the calcification of dental plaque and the proliferation of acid-producing bacteria. An untreated dental abscess, a localized infection of the root or gum line, transitions rapidly into systemic sepsis, a condition that, in a world devoid of broad-spectrum hospital-grade antibiotics and surgical intervention, becomes a definitive death sentence. Consequently, maintaining a sterile and structurally sound oral environment is not a cosmetic concern. It is fundamental immunological defense. The preventative armory must include high-concentration, stabilized fluoride gels, packaged in airtight dispensers to prevent degradation, alongside substantial reserves of crystalline xylitol powder. This specialized non-fermentable sugar substitute must be integrated into the daily routine. Its unique property lies in its ability to actively inhibit the proliferation of Streptococcus mutans, the primary bacterial culprit in dental decay, thereby acting as a continuous low-level biochemical countermeasure against infection. The demands extend with equal urgency to the visual apparatus. In a world dependent on low-power lighting, often involving flickering high-contrast, blue-spectrum LED lamps, the retina endures unprecedented oxidative stress. The tasks required for sustained function repairing gear, reading topographical maps, or executing nocturnal reconnaissance all hinge on exceptional visual acuity. Age and constant exposure rapidly diminish the concentration of protective pigments within the macula, the central region of the retina responsible for sharp, detailed vision. This accelerated degeneration, if unchecked, quickly reduces the survivor's operational fidelity to that of an impaired liability. Consequently, the definitive 3-year cache mandates the inclusion of highly specialized carotenoids, specifically lutein and zeaxanthin. These potent antioxidants operate as internal sunglasses, absorbing damaging blue light and neutralizing the free radicals generated by metabolic stress directly within the photoreceptor cells. Their sensitivity to environmental factors, particularly heat and light exposure, dictates an entirely separate, ultra-secure logistical protocol. These softgel capsules cannot reside near the bulk stores. They require storage in light-proof, thermal-buffered vacuum containers, ideally refrigerated or deep underground, ensuring their molecular structure remains intact for the requisite 3-year duration. This micromanagement of sensitive compounds illustrates the contrast between brute force hoarding and precision biological inventory. The fraction of an ounce of lutein, cost in pennies relative to a ton of rice, preserves the command center of the entire human machine. Furthermore, the final logistical phase necessitates the integration of specialized repair materials. The risk of traumatic dental fracture or catastrophic ocular damage from foreign debris is amplified by the reliance on physical labor and the constant use of improvised tools. Therefore, the inventory must contain professional-grade temporary dental filling composites, adhesive kits for minor tissue repair, and stabilized analgesic gels. These items, designed for immediate stabilization of trauma, transform a potentially lethal injury into a manageable setback. The cumulative effect of incorporating these dental and ocular components is the preservation of a high-fidelity operating unit, ensuring the survivor maintains the critical sensory and processing capabilities required to make nuanced survival-critical decisions long after the immediate crisis has passed. Nevertheless, the true measure of enduring viability shifts beyond structural and metabolic maintenance to the subtle yet absolute command of the endocrine system. The body's internal thermostat, the thyroid gland, dictates the fundamental pace of every cellular process. Prolonged exposure to stress and the inevitable environmental contaminants present in poorly regulated storage environments, subtle endocrine disruptors leaching from plastics or packaging, cause this delicate system to seize. Consequently, ensuring robust thyroid hormone conversion and synthesis becomes a pivotal, non-negotiable objective within the 3-year biological blueprint. This critical need translates directly into an inventory requirement for specialized chemical precursors. While the requirement for iodine has been established, it represents only half the process. Selenium, an often underappreciated trace element, functions as an essential cofactor for the dehydrogenase enzymes responsible for converting inactive thyroxine T4 into the metabolically active triiodothyron T3. Without adequate, steady selenium intake, the body starves for energy, even while the thyroid produces ample raw hormone. Furthermore, the amino acid L-tyrosine, the core building block for the thyroid hormone molecule, requires its own dedicated, stable reserve. This high-purity, encapsulated tyrosine, stored separately from bulk protein sources, guarantees that the essential production line for systemic energy regulation never encounters a catastrophic shortage. A further refinement involves the necessity of incorporating 2 specific, highly catalytic trace elements that facilitate specialized detoxification pathways. Molybdenum, required in minute quantities, is indispensable for the sulfite oxidase enzyme. This enzyme is solely responsible for processing sulfites and sulfated compounds, often heavily concentrated in preserved meats, dried fruits, and certain legumes. Without molybdenum, the body's ability to clear these metabolic intermediates fails, resulting in a systemic backup that mimics severe allergic reaction or neurological impairment. This tiny mineral acts as the critical fuse in an otherwise robust detoxification circuit. In parallel, consider the foundational importance of boron. This element, almost entirely absent from staple carbohydrates, is a potent modulator of steroid hormones, crucial for maximizing the efficacy of stored vitamin D and regulating the free availability of essential hormones like testosterone and estrogen. Its presence directly influences bone mineral density, maintenance, and sustained physical endurance. The inventory must treat these trace compounds, molybdenum and boron, not as general supplements, but as precision catalytic agents whose absence brings the entire biological network to a crippling halt. In this crucial analysis of long-term storage, recognizing the inherent limitations of even the most secure preservation techniques becomes paramount. Over a multi-year duration, microscopic failure is inevitable, often leading to the silent infiltration of mycotoxins, stably toxic fungal compounds produced by molds that thrive in stored grains, even those with low moisture content. These poisons, such as aflatoxins, are profoundly hepatotoxic and carcinogenic, representing a secondary, bioaccumulating threat distinct from bacteria. Activated carbon is largely ineffective against the structural complexity of many major Consequently, a dedicated, high-capacity chemical defense must be integrated. Specialized, pharmaceutical-grade binders, such as calcined calcium bentonite clay or chlorella, must be stored in large, highly desiccated containers. These compounds possess specific laminar structures that physically absorb the complex mycotoxin molecules in the digestive tract, shuttling them harmlessly out of the system before they can cross the intestinal barrier and overwhelm the liver. Such a defensive measure underscores that survival demands not just protection from the environment, but active protection against the inevitable biological decay within the supplies themselves. This is the ultimate defensive redundancy shield against the microscopic treachery of time and storage vulnerability. The analytical lens must now sharply focus on the biomechanical deterioration resulting from sustained, repetitive physical activity within an austere environment, a fate entirely distinct from either metabolic failure or toxicity. A survivor's longevity is ultimately governed by the durability of the structural tissues responsible for locomotion and task execution. Consider the necessity of continuous water hauling, firewood procurement, or manual security patrol. These are tasks defining the daily routine, translating into an accelerated wear rate on the major load-bearing joints, knees, hips, and shoulders. This relentless microtraumatic stress, when combined with nutritional deficits, precipitates a mechanical cascade toward immobility. Consequently, the definitive 3-year plan requires specialized supplements dedicated solely to mitigating articular cartilage erosion and supporting tendon resilience against The incorporation of glucosamine and chondroitin sulfates moves from an optional treatment for existing arthritis to a prophylactic mandatory compound. These compounds, integral components of the cartilage matrix, offer the necessary raw material for continuous structural regeneration. Stored in encapsulated, stable form, they are a preemptive defense against the catastrophic failure of weight-bearing joints, a failure that could transform a capable individual into a helpless invalid simply due to an inability to walk. Building upon this physical safeguard, however, is the equally crucial, often overlooked, requirement for high-potency collagen peptide. Standard protein consumption, while satisfying amino acid requirements, is inefficient at delivering the specific structural ratios required for dermal, vascular, and soft tissue repair. Trauma, even minor cuts or abrasions, heal slowly and imperfectly when systemic collagen synthesis is by collagen peptides, derived typically from bovine or marine sources and stored as highly purified, desiccated powder, dissolve easily into stored water. They serve as a direct, high-efficiency pathway for rapidly reinforcing skin integrity, a first-line barrier against infection, strengthening the elasticity of the cardiovascular system, essential for handling the sudden, intense physical demands of emergency exertion. Another essential facet of this mechanical maintenance involves the targeted administration of anti-inflammatory agents that operate outside the conventional pain relief model. Sustained physical output generates continuous inflammatory markers, leading to persistent soreness and reduced range of motion, which inherently lowers operational effectiveness. The survival inventory must include high-concentration, turmeric curcumin extracts. This potent, non-steroidal compound intervenes directly in the COX-2 inflammatory pathways without the detrimental gastrointestinal side effects associated with pharmaceutical non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, NSAIDs, used over long periods. Stored as stabilized, concentrated capsules, curcumin maintains high functional capacity while preserving the delicate lining of the stomach and organ already under stress from a restrictive diet. Furthermore, the management of sustained muscle function requires an understanding of recovery biochemistry. Exhaustion is not just a lack of ATP. It is the accumulation of metabolic waste products, notably lactic acid, and the depletion of readily available intracellular energy stores. The inclusion of pharmaceutical-grade DCI, monohydrate, stored in crystalline powder, offers a powerful physiological advantage. Creatine maximizes the capacity of the phosphocreatine system, effectively buffering muscle cells against rapid fatigue during high-intensity bursts of activity B. It lifting heavy objects, sprinting for cover, or engaging in intense manual labor. This reserve capacity translates directly into increased physical resilience and, critically, a faster recovery interval between demanding physical tasks. This strategic nutritional choice moves the survivor beyond mere maintenance and into a state of sustained, high-level functional readiness, ensuring that the physical cost of survival does not exceed the body's capacity for repair. This depth of planning acknowledges that long-term survival is an athletic endeavor, demanding the focused biochemical preparation of an elite athlete, not the haphazard provisions of a weekend camper. The logistical rigor of the 3-year plan must extend its scope into the specialized domain of managing the chronic, low-level radiation exposure that can follow significant industrial or geopolitical disruption. While immediate fallout requires specialized protective measures, the long-term threat lies in the ingestion and bioaccumulation of internal emitters, radioactive isotopes, like strontium-90, that contaminate the water supply, soil, and eventually any locally sourced food. These contaminants lodge themselves in tissue, mimicking essential element strontium-90, in bone, cesium-137 in muscleware. They deliver continuous, localized damage, leading to cancers and systemic immune failure years after the initial event. Consequently, the survival medicine chest requires high purity, stable reserves of compounds engineered for chelation and selective biological blocking. The established need for potassium iodide key to block the thyroid S uptake of radioactive iodine is merely the starting point. For cesium-137, which presents a decades-long threat, the inventory must contain Prussian blue, specifically designed for human consumption. This compound administered orally acts as an inert chemical trap within the gut, tightly binding the cesium ions and preventing their systemic absorption, thereby drastically reducing the internal radiation dose. Its integration into the preparedness strategy is non-negotiable for anyone anticipating survival in a contaminated zone. Building on this, the threat of strontium-90, a calcium analog, demands a proactive saturation strategy. Since the body incorporates strontium into bone only when native calcium levels are deficient, the strategic provisioning of stabilized high-dose calcium carbonate becomes a secondary defense against internal contamination. By maintaining a continuous, high systemic load of non-radioactive calcium, the body preferentially uptakes the inert isotope, effectively starving the strontium-90 of incorporation sites. This is a critical biological competitive block, transforming the mineral supplement into a vital anti-radiation measure. Furthermore, managing the acute biological response to any unprevented radiation damage requires focused antioxidant therapy, while general vitamins offer support. The massive oxidative burst resulting from radiation exposure demands compounds with specific cellular repair properties. The inclusion of high-concentration alpha-lipoic acid ALA is essential. ALA, unique among antioxidants, is both water and fat-soluble, enabling it to penetrate virtually all cellular compartments, including the nucleus, where DNA damage is most pronounced. It also possesses the unique capability to regenerate other crucial such as vitamin C and glutathione, thereby providing a systemic amplification of the body's repair mechanisms against the acute chemical injury caused by ionizing radiation. The logistical implication is clear. The most expensive, specialized elements of the inventory are not the largest in volume, but the smallest and most toxicologically precise. Prussian blue and high-dose ALA, stored in opaque, sealed containers, represent the ultimate insurance policy against invisible threats. Their proper deployment requires detailed, pre-existing protocols of failure to understand the specific half-lives and biological pathways of these isotopes renders the entire chemical defense useless. The sophisticated survivor manages not just hunger, but the complex threat matrix of chronic internal exposure that turns years of successful caloric survival into a delayed, terminal diagnosis. This nuanced biological warfare against the environment confirms that sustained existence demands a pharmacopoeia designed for atomic threats, not simply bacterial ones. The long-term resilience of the survival cache is inherently linked to the stability of the packaging materials themselves, transitioning the focus from contents to container a logistical battle against molecular diffusion and polymer degradation. Over a 3-year span, seemingly inert plastic storage containers begin to betray their contents through subtle chemical warfare. Standard, flexible plastics release minute quantities of plasticizers and potentially endocrine-disrupting monomers into stored fats and liquids, a process accelerated by temperature fluctuations common in basements or improvised caches. This slow, steady contamination undermines the purity of the carefully selected food matrix, adding another layer of low-level toxicity that must be actively managed. Consequently, the blueprint for a definitive cache demands a radical shift toward primary storage in chemically inert materials. While mylar bags are effective for bulk solids, the critical, volatile components pharmaceutical-vitamins, oils, and powdered extracts must be transferred to small, amber glass vials or food-grade ceramic containers, rigorously sealed with chemically resistant gas. Glass, being non-porous and chemically stable, prevents the exchange of gases and the leaching of contaminants, ensuring that the integrity of the micronutrient arsenal is maintained over decades, not just years. This seemingly simple upgrade in packaging represents a major reduction in the bioaccumulative toxicity burden over time. Building on this material defense, the necessity of rigorous atmospheric management within the storage vessels themselves becomes paramount. While oxygen absorbers eliminate the immediate risk of oxidation and insect proliferation in dry goods, they do not address the subtle decay caused by residual humidity and trace volatile organic compounds (VOCs) that off-gas from the stored materials. The inclusion of specialized molecular sieves and high-capacity desiccant packs, placed within the secondary containment of the critical vitamin and protein stores, ensures that the microenvironment within the sealed container remains high. This extreme dryness halts the hydrolytic degradation of sensitive compounds like vitamin C and certain amino acids, extending their functional shelf life well beyond conventional expectations. Furthermore, the logistical plan requires addressing the inevitable threat of thermal cycling, the seasonal swing in temperature that drives molecular movement and accelerates chemical reactions. Storage locations must be evaluated not just for security, but for thermal inertia. A shallow underground cache, or a storage area deeply recessed within a building's concrete slab, maintains a far more stable temperature than an attic or a poorly insulated shed. This thermal stability is crucial for preserving the efficacy of stored fats and oils, which suffer exponential rancidity acceleration with every rise in ambient temperature. The difference between a Fahrenheit storage environment and a 55-degree environment can easily double the effective shelf life of essential fatty acid reserves. The ultimate measure of storage sophistication, therefore, lies not in volume, but in thermal and chemical management. The discerning survivor does not simply fill containers. They engineer a stable, inert microenvironment for every category of nutrient. The investment in specialized glass, industrial-grade and the excavation necessary for a thermally stable cache demonstrates an understanding that the integrity of the container is inextricably linked to the biological survival of the consumer. A pristine vitamin stored in a stable glass vial is a functional asset. The same vitamin degraded by thermal cycling in cheap plastic is merely inert volume occupying valuable space. This detailed mastery of materials science ensures the biological clock within the pantry does not run faster than the clock of the survivor. The execution of the 3-year plan demands a transition from static storage to dynamic, knowledge-based deployment, a system of biofeedback and caloric titration that mirrors the management of a high-performance, closed ecological system. It is insufficient merely to possess the supplies. One must accurately gauge the internal need against the external reality, optimizing consumption to maximize both longevity of the cache and sustained peak performance. The human body, particularly under duress, is a complex, non-linear system, and its nutrient requirements fluctuate wildly based on activity level, ambient temperature, and psychological stress. Consequently, the definitive survival blueprint necessitates a methodology for tracking metabolic expenditure with crude yet effective precision. Since sophisticated medical diagnostics are unavailable, the survivor must rely on proxy indicators. The core metrics include basal metabolic rate calculation, adjusted by activity factor, estimated by dedicated logbook entries detailing hours spent on strenuous labor maintenance or rest, daily measurement of resting heart rate and blood pressure using simple mechanical gauges from the survival kit, and rigorous tracking of body weight and composition. Changes using a small, high-precision scale. This data informs the daily caloric adjustment, preventing the slow, catastrophic loss of lean muscle mass that occurs when caloric intake is set too low for sustained labor. Building upon this, the utilization of specialized low-cost chemical testing strips becomes mandatory for monitoring internal chemistry. Simple urinalysis strips, designed to detect ketones, glucose, and trace protein, offer immediate, actionable feedback on metabolic function. The detection of high ketones, for instance, signals excessive reliance on fat reserves and potential metabolic imbalance, prompting an immediate, strategic increase in complex carbohydrate intake from the bulk stores, thus sparing vital protein and fat reserves. The presence of protein in the urine, conversely, flags potential renal stress, requiring a temporary reduction in protein consumption and a mandated increase in water and electrolyte intake. These strips transform the subjective feeling of wellness into objective, quantifiable data points guiding the rationing process. Another critical layer of this dynamic management involves the tactical deployment of specialized protein sources. While bulk beans and grains provide basic amino acids, maintaining cognitive edge during periods of acute stress requires highly specific neurotransmitter precursors. Therefore, the inventory must include small, concentrated reserves of highly purified essential amino acids, particularly branched-chain amino acids, BCAAs, isoleucine, valine. These compounds bypass immediate liver processing, moving directly to muscle and brain tissue, where they mitigate central fatigue and maintain neurological drive during protracted periods of high stress, vigilance, or forced wake. These are not daily rations, but tactical assets deployed strictly during high-demand operational phases. The final element of dynamic inventory management is the implementation of scheduled, nutrient-loading cycles, recognizing that the digestive system adapts and slows efficiency over time. The plan includes periodic, strategic shifts in the dietary matrix. For 1 week, every 6 months, the caloric ratio is intentionally inverted high-fat and moderate protein, with minimal carbohydrates designed to stimulate metabolic flexibility, challenge the existing microbial flora, and maximize the absorption of fat-soluble B-amines, A, D, A, K. This planned cycle prevents metabolic stagnation and ensures the entire chemical arsenal remains biologically accessible, moving the inventory management from simple rationing to complex, adaptive metabolic tuning, ensuring the human machine remains optimally receptive to the fuel provided. The comprehensive mastery of survival logistics must ultimately resolve the profound inherent vulnerability presented by the complete absence of a functional, external medical supply chain. In a 3-year vacuum, simple infections, minor injuries, or acute allergic reactions transform instantly into existential threats. Therefore, the definitive biological blueprint requires a dedicated, professional-grade pharmaceutical CASA-tiered inventory of highly stable, broad-spectrum antimicrobial agents and targeted physiological interventions stored under conditions that maximize their limited shelf life. The primary antimicrobial defense centers on a carefully curated spectrum of stabilized antibiotics, recognizing the rise of resistance and the difficulty of diagnosis without culture testing. The cache must contain at least 3 distinct classes of antibiotics: a long-acting penicillin derivative succinctly, amoxicillin, a potent macrolide like azithromycin, effective against respiratory and atypical pathogens, and a fluoroquinone such as ciprofloxacin, necessary for serious gastrointestinal or deep tissue infections. Each drug must be stored in its original desiccated powder or tablet form in an oxygen-free, climate-controlled subcompartment with meticulous tracking of its degradation rate. The administration protocol must be equally rigorous, demanding a profound understanding of diagnostic indicators and full-course compliance to prevent the generation of resistant strains, a mistake that would doom the survivor to a future of untreatable bacterial threats. Building on the antimicrobial defense, the inventory must proactively address the constant risk of debilitating, low-grade parasitic or fungal infections, often introduced through compromised water or stored foods. These are persistent, energy-draining afflictions that do not immediately kill, but steadily erode the body's resilience. The necessary countermeasures include a reserve of specialized antiparasitic agents, such as metronidazole and broad-spectrum antifungals, stored alongside detailed usage guides. Their deployment is tactical, used only when symptomatic evidence, chronic diarrhea, persistent rash, or systemic fatigue unresponsive to nutrient correction, strongly suggests their specific targets. Another essential layer involves managing pain and acute inflammation without compromising long-term organ health. Sustained use of NSAIDs stresses the liver and gastrointestinal lining. Consequently, the cache must include not just pain relievers, but high-dose, stabilized anti-inflammatory compounds like prescription-strength corticosteroids used sparingly for acute, localized inflammation or severe allergic reactions, and, critically, high-purity lidocaine gel for localized pain management, and wound preparation. This strategic reserve minimizes the systemic load on the liver while preserving function. Finally, the inventory must contain the emergency tools necessary for immediate field surgery and stabilization, beyond sterile sutures and trauma bandages. This includes dedicated reserves of injectable epinephrine pre-dose to manage catastrophic anaphylaxis or acute bronchial spasm conditions that require intervention within minutes. The inclusion of these highly sensitive temperature-volatile components underscores the commitment to biological reality. The greatest inventory challenge is not storing rice, but maintaining the chemical stability of volatile life-saving pharmaceuticals, recognizing that the lack of one small injection can negate 3 years of meticulous nutritional planning. The final, culminating phase of biological readiness transcends the purely physical inventory, demanding the integration of specialized knowledge, reserve the intellectual capital required to transform stored chemicals into life-saving treatments. Without access to clinical consultation or diagnostic technology, the survivor must become a self-sufficient biochemical engineer and diagnostic technician. The stored pharmaceutical inventory is useless, even dangerous, without a meticulously preserved and accessible knowledge base detailing dosages, contraindications, and treatment protocols for non. Consequently, the blueprint requires the creation of a physical, hardened library of specific medical and botanical texts, distinct from general survival manuals. This library must include high-resolution, printed, and water-resistant volumes of specialized clinical guides, pharmacopoeias detailing the mechanism of action, and interaction effects for every stored antibiotic and pharmaceutical compound. Furthermore, detailed anatomical charts and wound management guides must be preserved. Reliance on fragile digital media is a catastrophic failure point. The enduring power of knowledge must be secured in redundant, analog formats. Building on this essential library is the requirement for a functional, low-technology diagnostic kit. Since complex blood work is impossible, the survivor must leverage observable physical signs against the known nutritional deficiencies. The kit must include specialized diagnostic filters such as woods, lamps, UV light sources, which when used correctly can detect early-stage fungal infections or subtle changes in skin. Composition indicative of specific nutrient deficiencies, transforming an ambiguous symptom into a definable ailment, guiding treatment selection. Simple hematology, achieved through basic microscope slides and a low-magnification field microscope, also included in the kit, allows for rudimentary evaluation of blood cell morphology, offering proxy indicators for anemia, iron, or B12, deficiency or chronic infection, data points informing the precise deployment of the micronutrient reserves. Another critical element of this knowledge integration involves the identification and safe processing of local, endemic wild food sources, a necessity for supplementing the stagnant chemical profile of the stored diet. Particularly after the 3-year mark, no matter how perfect the stockpile, biological diversity remains the ultimate guarantor of long-term health. The knowledge base must include specific, geographically targeted field guides detailing the identification, processing, and safe consumption of local medicinal herbs and high-yield wild edibles, rich in otherwise unavailable nutrients like vitamin K or rare trace minerals. This knowledge buffer effectively expands the 3-year timeline indefinitely by transitioning the survivor from reliance on a closed system to adaptive harvesting within the local ecosystem, a critical step in achieving true sustainability. The sum of this final phase ensures that the survivor is not merely a caretaker of chemistry, but an informed practitioner. The ultimate value of the freeze-dried kale, the B-complex vials, and the antibiotic reserves is unlocked only when the survivor possesses the intellectual capacity to diagnose their own internal needs and deploy the targeted chemical intervention, precisely distinguishing minor ailment from existential threat. This confluence of rigorous inventory and applied biological knowledge transforms the survival cache from a stockpile of inert materials into a highly responsive, self-administered system of adaptive human maintenance. The operational reality of prolonged self-sufficiency invariably introduces the element of localized toxicity, a threat distinct from system-wide nutritional depletion or global radiological risks. Now, consider the insidious accumulation of metallic compounds derived not from industrial runoff, but from the simple, continuous act of cooking and preparing food within an unstandardized survival setting, the utilization of salvaged, often compromised, cookware aluminum pots pitted by acidic food preparation, iron skillets, leaching heavy metals due to inconsistent seasoning, or, most perilously, low-grade galvanized containers repurposed for water-boiling presence, a pathway for chronic, low-dose exposure to metals like cadmium and zinc oxide. Over weeks, these contaminants integrate into the food supply, leading to a subtle yet significant interference with neurological and enzymatic functions, mimicking the symptoms of chronic fatigue or depression. A critical mitigation strategy involves strict enforcement of material science principles in the kitchen area. The survival blueprint must designate a reserve of non-reactive medical grade 316 stainless steel cookware reserved exclusively for the preparation of acidic foods like stored tomatoes or vinegar-based additives, thereby preventing the accelerated corrosion and subsequent leaching that plagues salvaged metals. Furthermore, the cache must incorporate reserves of activated charcoal, specifically rated for use as an internal detoxifying agent, not merely for water filtration. This highly porous carbon, administered strategically, acts as a general chelating agent within the gastrointestinal tract, capturing and neutralizing incidental metal ions before they can cross the gut barrier and enter systemic circulation. Moving forward, the reliance on stored grains, even when perfectly preserved, introduces the distinct threat of phytate overload. Phytic acid, naturally occurring in the outer husks of beans and grains, acts as a fierce inhibitor, binding essential minerals like zinc, iron, and calcium, rendering them biologically unavailable for absorption. Even the most generous supplemental intake is partially negated if consumed concurrently with unsoaked or improperly prepared staples. Consequently, the long-term survival protocol dictates the mandatory implementation of traditional processing techniques, extended soaking, fermentation, and controlled sprouting. To support this biochemical necessity, the inventory requires dedicated supplies of organic, non-irradiated cultures, such as small amounts of live sourdough starter or high-activity lactobacillus cultures, stored in stable, freeze-dried form. These are deployed not for flavor, but as tools for enzymatic conversion. The fermentation process activates phytase, the enzyme that naturally dismantles phytic acid, thereby dramatically increasing the bioavailability of the stored mineral wealth. This intellectual integration of primitive food science maximizes the nutritional return on the caloric investment, turning bulk staples from a potential biological impediment into an efficient, usable nutrient source. Moreover, the psychological toll of dietary monotony, already addressed with flavor enhancers, requires a deeper biochemical solution linked to sustained cognitive performance. The constant cycling of stress hormones creates a persistent state of neural excitability, hindering the deep, restorative sleep essential for long-term mental health. The survivalist's ability to maintain complex operational security relies utterly on functional REM cycles. Therefore, the cache must incorporate amino acid precursors specifically targeted at neurotransmitter stabilization. Specifically, L-theanine, derived from tea leaves and stored in pure powder form, offers a proven, non-sedative, anxiolytic effect. Its inclusion is intended to promote alpha wave generation in the brain, inducing a state of calm focus and improving sleep latency. This substance acts as a gentle, yet powerful, modulator of brain activity, counteracting the lingering hypervigilance induced by chronic cortisol exposure. The subtle shift from constant neural agitation to restorative calm is a direct, measurable investment in the survivor's enduring strategic capability, confirming that peak functionality is achieved through targeted biochemical engineering of the central nervous system, ensuring the mind remains a clear, decisive instrument against the backdrop of perpetual threat. The subtle erosion of health often begins not with what is absent from the plate, but what is present or absent in the drinking vessel. While filtration and disinfection secure water purity against microbial pathogens, they strip the fluid of its vital electrochemical identity. reverse osmosis and high-capacity carbon filtration, mandatory for safety in a compromised infrastructure. Yield water that is chemically aggressive, leaching essential minerals from the body's tissues to compensate for its own ionic deficit. This phenomenon demands the implementation of precise daily remineralization protocols, transforming the simple act of hydration into a sophisticated laboratory process. The survivalist must therefore store pharmaceutical-grade mineral salts, specifically measured ratios of magnesium sulfate, calcium carbonate, and minute concentrations of potassium chloride to reconstitute a biologically compatible, electrically balanced water source. Failure to adopt this rigor accelerates the leaching of calcium from bone and disrupts the cellular charge, leading to chronic fatigue and muscle cramps, often misdiagnosed as simple exertion. Conversely, the true mastery of internal detoxification lies not just in binders, but in enhancing the body's endogenous antioxidant capacity. The single most important internal defense against free radicals and accumulated metabolic poisons is the peptide known as gluten. These molecules, synthesized primarily in the liver, is critical for cellular defense and requires a steady, high-quality supply of its specific precursors, the sulfur-containing amino acids, methionine, and cysteine. These essential sulfur-building blocks, which are easily depleted under periods of sustained stress or high-protein metabolism, must be stockpiled in concentrated, highly bioavailable forms, such as unacetyl. This specialized supplement, stored in dark, airtight containers, acts as a guaranteed feedstock for glutathione production, maintaining the cellular machinery required to neutralize the daily onslaught of endogenous toxins that accumulate even in the most meticulously planned diet. Without this capacity, the survivor's internal environment degrades, rendering them susceptible to chronic inflammatory states and accelerating cellular. Furthermore, the logistical integrity of the bulk staples, despite the use of mylar and oxygen remains perpetually threatened by the persistence of deep storage pests. Microscopic insect eggs and larvae, inherent to most commercial grains, lie dormant, only to hatch months or years into storage when seals weaken or temperatures fluctuate. This insidious biological contamination does not just consume calories, it introduces waste products and creates localized pockets of moisture that promote mold growth. The sophisticated defense against this silent, burrowing enemy necessitates the integration of non-toxic, high-purity diatomaceous earth D into the external protective layer of the bulk stores. This finely milled silica powder, placed between the mylar bag and the rigid bucket walls, acts as a physical, desiccant barrier. Its microscopic razor-like structure mechanically destroys the exoskeletons of crawling insects, preventing them from breaching the primary seal. This chemical-free, physical barrier ensures that the stored grain remains a pristine, isolated environment for decades, not merely a few years. In parallel, achieving the necessary consistency and energy delivery, crucial for maintaining focus during demanding tasks, extends beyond general carbohydrate reserves. Blood sugar stability is the true arbiter of sustained cognitive output. To combat the inevitable glycemic peaks and troughs associated with processed survival carbohydrates, the inventory must include specialized complex polysaccharides that function as potent sources of resistant starch, such as high amylose maize starch. These starches are engineered to bypass rapid digestion in the stomach and small intestine, instead feeding the colon slowly. This not only fuels the beneficial gut flora, but, more crucially, provides a sustained, ultra-low glycemic release of energy over many hours. Deploying this specific type of carbohydrate transforms the energy curve from a series of sharp, debilitating spikes and crashes into a flat, predictable plateau, ensuring that manual labor capacity and critical decision-making are maintained without the energy debt that cripples the unprepared survivor. This bioengineered approach secures the energy matrix at the cellular level, confirming that successful longevity is a function of consistent, low-variance physiological function. The exterior envelope of the human machine, the skin, functions as the largest organ and the primary physical barrier against environmental toxicity and systemic infection. Prolonged exposure to harsh, unconditioned extremes of temperature and improvised cleaning agent strips the skin of its essential lipid barrier, leading to microscopic fissures, chronic dryness, and a systemic vulnerability that precedes severe dermatological and immunological breakdown. The survival inventory, consequently, must transcend basic antiseptic measures. It must incorporate stable, high-purity reserves of essential barrier, stabilized ceramides, and cholesterol derivatives stored in anhydrous formulas to prevent degradation. These compounds are not a luxury. They are applied tactically to replenish the stratum's capacity to regulate water loss and maintain immunological integrity, effectively transforming the skin from a passive boundary into an active self-repairing shield against external microbial ingress. A separate, yet intertwined concern involves the body's compromised ability to maintain thermal homeostasis. In the face of extremes in seasonal change, the survivor relies heavily on their intricate internal regulatory mechanisms. However, a diet lacking the full complexity of necessary substrates often starves the body of the specific hormonal precursors essential for robust thermogenesis and adaptive sweating. Consequentially, the cache must hold dedicated reserves of specialized water-soluble amino acid complexes designed to support catecholamine production. These precursors help maintain the adrenal medulla's capacity to trigger rapid metabolic responses, necessary for resisting hypothermia in cold conditions or mitigating heat exhaustion during high noon labor. This preparation ensures that the nervous system retains the chemical horsepower to command immediate physiological adjustments, preventing rapid, non-recoverable thermal debt that simple caloric input cannot remedy. Building on this systemic regulation, the logistical necessity of relying on shelf-stable preserved protein sources, particularly dried meats or powdered bone broth derivatives, introduces the unique cumulative risk of biogenic amine buildup. Even under optimal, oxygen-free storage, minute enzymatic activity within these preserved products can lead to the slow accumulation of histamines and other vasoactive toxins. For many individuals, this continuous, cumulative exposure results in debilitating pseudoallergic reactions, manifesting as severe headaches, chronic gastrointestinal turmoil, and pervasive systemic inflammation symptoms, often mistaken for nutritional deficiencies or infectious disease. Accordingly, the pharmaceutical reserve must include a stable supply of dow-diamine oxidase, enzyme supplements or pharmaceutical grade, H1 and H2 histamine receptor blockers. These agents function as internal chemical interceptors, neutralizing the biogenic amines released during the digestion of aged protein, thereby guaranteeing the usability and safety of a crucial, expensive caloric source and protecting the survivor from internally generated chemical distress. Furthermore, the visual system faces persistent operational stress from the necessity of maneuvering in perpetually low-lumen environments, relying heavily on peripheral rod vision. This continuous strain accelerates the depletion of the retinoids, responsible for regenerating the crucial visual purple pigment required for contrast and detail recognition. Now, consider how this affects the critical ability to distinguish subtle trip hazards or veiled threats in near. The loss of contrast sensitivity drastically reduces reaction time and increases the risk of debilitating injury. To mitigate this specific retinal fatigue, the blueprint mandates the specific incorporation of supplemental retinaldehyde precursors, which are distinct from generic vitamin A, meticulously stored in light-blocking containers. These focused compounds ensure the rapid, efficient reconstitution of the visual pigment, protecting the nuanced capability of the eye to perform fine discrimination tasks essential for continuous operational safety, transforming night vision from a debilitating struggle into a sustained, reliable advantage. Reflecting on this journey so far, one central realization crystallizes: the perceived simplicity of long-term survival is a profound and catastrophic illusion. The initial months of any large-scale disruption are dominated by the visceral, immediate fear of emptiness, a fear addressed by the visceral response of accumulating preserved bulk. Yet, the investigation has led us far past the tonnage of sealed commodities and deep into the demanding, high-resolution architecture of human viability. We have charted a transition from the coarse calculus of energy expenditure to the nuanced molecular requirements of enzyme cofactors, hormonal precursors, and cellular membrane integrity. The success of sustained function ultimately rests not on the sheer height of the stockpiled pile, but on the chemical purity and strategic deployment of its rarest, most volatile constituents. The threats uncovered do not operate in isolation. They converge into a powerful destructive cascade. Deficiency compounds toxicity, while chronic unaddressed stress accelerates the structural and chemical breakdown of the body's essential systems. The human organism, viewed now not as a crude furnace, but as a high-performance closed-loop chemical refinery, faces a perpetual, multi-front war, filtering the inevitable ingestion of environmental contaminants and mycotoxins, while simultaneously attempting to construct complex hormones and repair fatigued, damaged tissues from a limited, stagnant pool of molecular building blocks. T's delicate, relentless balancing act demands continuous intellectual intervention. The storage vessel itself, whether a bucket or a mylar bag, is transformed into a meticulously controlled environmental inert shell, protecting volatile compounds from thermal shock, moisture ingress, and the self-destructive forces of molecular decay. The battle shifts entirely inward, fought on the microscopic fields of renal efficiency, mitochondrial output, and neurological resilience. The depth of planning, detailed, rigorous mathematics of specific elemental replacement, the prophylactic deployment of biological buffers, and the precise monitoring of metabolic byproducts reveals that the true scarcity is not physical food, but functional, specialized knowledge. The disciplined survivor operates as their own pharmacist, their own pathologist, and their own logistician. They understand, with crystalline clarity, that a failure in thermal management today precipitates a catastrophic loss of essential antioxidant capacity 6 months from now. The entire inventory becomes a complex, interactive clock, each component's stability dependent upon the integrity and molecular health of the others. This is the fundamental difference between simple hoarding for 6 months and engineering for 3 years, a systemic approach, where every gram of stored material serves a defined, non-negotiable chemical mandate. This complex orchestration of supply, systemic defense, and self-diagnosis culminates in a singular, defining principle of enduring resilience. It forces a complete rejection of the fantasy of simple, passive endurance, replacing it with the rigorous reality of active biological stewardship. We have meticulously stripped away the layers of conventional preparedness to expose the vital, microscopic threads that hold the complex human ecosystem together. Having established the critical, non-negotiable requirements for enduring peak function, the robust defense against silent chemical and biological erosion, the path ahead leads to the consolidation of these deep-seated insights. We must now synthesize this comprehensive, rigorous biological truth into the ultimate operational directive. Defining what this mastery over material scarcity and molecular volatility truly yields, the focus shifts, finally, from the mechanics of preparation to the ultimate, profound meaning of sustained, functional life beyond the precipice of societal support. The ghost of Arthur, resting peacefully amidst his useless trove of preserved bulk, serves as the ultimate, chilling validation of this meticulous, molecular investigation. His demise was not a failure of hoarding, but a profound spiritual and biological indictment of shallow preparation. The vast, inert store of calories, sealed against the world, became the sarcophagus of his own ignorance. He succumbed to a killer far more insidious than starvation or violence, the slow, inexorable self-poisoning that arises from believing that human survival is merely an accounting ledger of mass and volume. The narrative we have constructed here is not one of fantasy or it is an architectural blueprint for biological endurance, forged in the crucible of chemical precision and unforgiving logic. The defining insight of this exhaustive inventory is the profound, almost spiritual relationship between sustenance and function. Survival, in its truest, most demanding form, is not achieved by simple physical presence, but by sustained cognitive clarity and immunological resilience. It is the ability to maintain the complex, electrical language of the brain, to ensure the unfaltering command of the endocrine system, and to guarantee the ceaseless repair of the cellular matrix tasks that require dedicated molecular precursors far more costly and fragile than any sack of grain. The strategic expenditure on a few grams of selenium, on specialized carotenoids or on pharmaceutical-grade stabilizers represents an investment in human capital itself, preserving the capacity for decision-making and innovation that ultimately defines longevity in an environment stripped of systemic support. The high cost of these small vials and carefully sealed powders is the premium paid for retaining sanity and functional vigor. This synthesis of chemistry and logistics compels a redefinition of wealth in a disrupted world. True wealth is not measured in physical gold or silver, nor in tons of sealed staples, but in the milligrams of critical cofactors available to the body's metabolic machinery. It is to deep functional knowledge required to deploy those rare assets with surgical precision, diagnosing internal failures without the aid of modern instruments. The successful outcome, the transition from mere existence to sustained functional living beyond the 3-year marquise, the result of transforming the survival cache from a fearful reaction into a finely tuned, adaptive system. It is the realization that the greatest defense lies within the microstructure of the body's own continuous maintenance cycle. The journey through this biological reality demands a continuous, sober reflection on one's own vulnerabilities. It is an acknowledgement that the modern human, having outsourced nutrient complexity to a global supply chain, is chemically fragile. And that self-sufficiency is a rigorous discipline of compensatory biological engineering. The final, enduring implication of this deep dive into deficiency is an encouragement to move beyond the comforting lies of ease and volume. Let the fate of authors stand as a permanent sentinel against apathy. The true spirit of survival resides in the meticulous logbook, the pristine glass vial of essential amino acids, and the unwavering commitment to the human engine, not just with energy, but with the specific, necessary molecules required for its continuous, complex cell. Only by mastering this invisible chemistry can the survivor ensure that they not only endure the long twilight, but emerge from it with their cognitive and physical integrity wholly intact, proving that knowledge, when applied, is the most powerful resource of all.